What if the three richest kingdoms on earth quietly decided America was no longer a safe place to park their money? Not because of war, not because of sanctions, but because of how Washington is conducting itself on the world stage right now. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar together hold trillions, not billions, trillions, in U.S. assets, treasury bonds, real estate, and financial markets. And there are serious signals coming from credible places that those nations are reassessing that relationship. When Gulf states start whispering about redirecting sovereign wealth funds away from dollar-denominated assets, that is not gossip. That is a tectonic shift in the foundation of American economic power. The petrodollar system, the very architecture that has kept the U.S. dollar dominant for 50 years, was built on a handshake with these exact countries. So when that handshake starts to loosen, every American with a savings account, a mortgage, or a retirement fund has a reason to pay very close attention to what happens next. Let's back up and understand exactly how we got here, because this story did not start yesterday, and it does not begin with a tweet or a press conference. It begins decades ago in the early 1970s, when the United States struck one of the most consequential financial deals in modern history. After President Nixon took America off the gold standard in 1971, the dollar needed a new anchor. And that anchor became oil. The arrangement was straightforward but enormously powerful. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states would sell their oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, America would provide military protection, weapons, and security guarantees to those regimes. It was a marriage of convenience that reshaped the entire global financial order. Every country on Earth that needed oil, which was every country on Earth, had to first acquire U.S. dollars to buy it. That single structural fact is what made the dollar the world's reserve currency. That is what funded American deficits, kept interest rates manageable, and allowed Washington to borrow and spend in ways no other nation on the planet could replicate. Now, here is where it gets critically important. Saudi Arabia alone holds an estimated $700 billion in U.S. Treasury securities and dollar-denominated assets. The UAE sovereign wealth funds, particularly the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, manage somewhere between $800 billion and $1 trillion, a significant portion of which sits in American markets. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund controls around $450 billion in global assets, and the United States has historically been one of its largest destinations for investment. When you add it all up, you are talking about somewhere in the range of $2 to $3 trillion that these three nations have placed directly or indirectly into the American financial ecosystem. That is not a rounding error. That is a load-bearing wall in the structure of the U.S. economy. And right now, there are real, documented, credible conversations happening at the highest levels of Gulf state governance about whether that wall should stay where it is. Let's talk about why those conversations are happening, because the reasons are layered and they go much deeper than any single political moment. The first layer is trust. The relationship between Washington and Riyadh, Washington and Abu Dhabi, Washington and Doha has always been transactional. It was never sentimental. These are pragmatic governments led by pragmatic rulers, and they make decisions based on cold calculations about stability, returns, and reliability. What they have been watching over the past several years, accelerating now, is an America that feels increasingly unpredictable. Not just politically unpredictable in the way that elections always bring change, but structurally unpredictable. An America whose commitments shift depending on who is in the Oval Office, whose trade policy can reverse overnight, and whose relationship with international institutions has become deeply erratic. The Gulf states watched what happened with Russia's foreign reserves after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. They watched the United States and its Western allies freeze approximately $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets almost overnight. Now, whatever you think about that decision from a policy standpoint, think about it from the perspective of a Gulf state finance minister sitting in Riyadh or Dubai. They saw that dollar-denominated reserves are not untouchable. They saw that the United States is willing to weaponize the financial system in ways that were previously considered off-limits. And the immediate rational question that every sovereign wealth fund manager in the world asked themselves in the weeks after that decision was, could this ever happen to us? The answer they arrived at was, it is no longer impossible. And in the world of sovereign wealth management, no longer impossible is enough to begin quietly diversifying away from dollar exposure. That diversification has been happening. It has been slow, methodical, and largely out of the headlines, which is exactly how these governments prefer to operate. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, the PIF, which Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been building into one of the most aggressive sovereign wealth vehicles in the world, has been systematically expanding into Asian markets, European infrastructure, and non-dollar assets. They have been buying into Chinese financial instruments, investing in Indian technology, building positions in assets denominated in currencies other than the dollar. This is not speculation. This is in their published investment strategies and in the financial disclosures that analysts and economists have been tracking carefully. The direction of travel is clear. The question is how fast that direction accelerates and under what circumstances it tips from a gradual rebalancing into something much more abrupt. That abruptness is exactly what is on the table right now. And the reason it is on the table comes back to the specific texture of the current moment in U.S. foreign policy. The Trump administration's approach to the Middle East has been, to put it diplomatically, unconventional. On one hand, there has been a deliberate effort to cultivate personal relationships with Gulf leaders, to emphasize arms deals, to position these partnerships as central to American strategy in the region. But on the other hand, the administration has taken positions and made statements that have genuinely alarmed the governments of all three of these nations in very specific ways. The situation with Qatar is particularly instructive because Qatar is a fascinating and complicated case. Qatar hosts the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East, Al Udeid Air Base, which is home to tens of thousands of American troops and is the operational hub for U.S. military activity across the entire region. At the same time, Qatar has relationships with actors that Washington officially considers adversarial, including Hamas, including Iran, including elements of the Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar has always played this double role, and Washington has largely tolerated it because the military relationship was too valuable to sacrifice over ideological disagreements. But the current dynamic has introduced new friction. There have been moments of public tension, statements from American officials that were read in Doha as hostile rather than merely firm, and a general sense in Qatar's government that the reliability of the American relationship is no longer something they can take as a given. Saudi Arabia's situation is different but equally revealing. Mohammed bin Salman spent years calibrating his relationship with Washington, betting heavily on the Trump orbit during the first administration, watching that relationship become politically toxic for a period after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and then navigating the Biden years, which were genuinely hostile. Now Trump is back, and MBS has reasons to feel vindicated in his patience. But MBS is also a leader who has spent the last several years aggressively pursuing a Vision 2030 agenda that is explicitly about reducing Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil revenue and, by extension, on the petrodollar architecture that has defined the kingdom's relationship with America for 50 years. He is not doing this because he hates America. He is doing it because he is a rational actor who has watched the global energy transition begin to unfold, who understands that the oil for dollar deal has a finite lifespan, and who is determined to position Saudi Arabia for the world that comes after that deal expires. The question for Washington is whether American policy is accelerating that timeline or slowing it down. And then there is the broader economic context, which is impossible to separate from the geopolitical one. The United States is carrying a national debt that is now north of $34 trillion. Interest payments on that debt have become one of the largest line items in the federal budget. The ability of the U.S. government to manage that debt load depends heavily on continued foreign demand for Treasury securities. If the Gulf states, along with China and Japan, who are also major holders, begin to reduce their Treasury exposure, the consequences ripple through everything: mortgage rates, car loans, business investment, the cost of financing the federal government itself. This is not a theoretical risk that economists discuss in academic papers. This is a real and present vulnerability in the American fiscal position, and the people who manage sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf are absolutely aware of it. They understand the leverage they hold, even if they are far too diplomatically sophisticated to say so out loud. There is also the question of the broader realignment that has been happening in global finance and geopolitics simultaneously. The BRICS expansion, the growing momentum behind efforts to conduct international trade in currencies other than the dollar, the deepening economic relationships between Gulf states and China, all of this creates an environment in which moving money away from dollar assets carries lower costs and lower risks than it would have even 10 years ago. Saudi Arabia joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a dialogue partner. The UAE has been deepening its economic relationship with Beijing in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Qatar has maintained its own complex web of relationships across the globe. These are not countries that are locked into the American orbit the way they were in 1975 or even in 2005. They have options, and having options changes behavior, even when those options are not immediately exercised. What makes this moment particularly acute is that the signals coming from Gulf capitals are not being sent privately. They are being sent in ways that are visible to the markets, visible to analysts, and visible to anyone paying attention. When Saudi officials publicly discuss pricing oil in currencies other than the dollar, even hypothetically, that is a signal. When Abu Dhabi Investment Authority begins publishing investment reports that show a declining percentage of dollar-denominated assets, that is a signal. When Qatar's leadership makes pointed public statements about the importance of economic sovereignty and diversification, that is a signal. These governments communicate through action and through calibrated public positioning, and the calibration right now is pointing in a direction that should be concentrating minds in Washington. Here is what the average American needs to understand about what happens if even a fraction of this plays out at scale. If Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar were to meaningfully reduce their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities over a period of even 2 to 3 years, the Federal Reserve would face an extraordinarily difficult set of choices. Either it allows interest rates to rise substantially to attract alternative buyers for that debt, which would crush the housing market, strangle business investment, and likely trigger a recession, or it steps in to purchase those securities itself, which is the mechanism known as quantitative easing and which carries its own serious risks of stoking inflation. There is no version of this scenario that is painless for ordinary Americans. And the pain would not be abstract. It would show up in the interest rate on your credit card, the cost of refinancing your mortgage, the yield on your retirement account, and the overall health of the job market. The thing about financial architecture is that it feels permanent right up until it doesn't. The dollar's dominance has felt like a law of nature for so long that most Americans have never had to think about the assumptions it rests on. But those assumptions are not laws of nature. They are agreements. They are relationships. They are deals that were struck under specific circumstances and that require ongoing maintenance and mutual benefit to remain in place. What is happening right now in the relationship between Washington and the Gulf states is a stress test on those agreements. And the results of that stress test are going to depend enormously on choices being made right now in real time by the current administration and by the leaders in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha. What is especially striking when you study this closely is how little public attention this dynamic receives in American political discourse. The conversation in Washington tends to focus on tariffs, on immigration, on domestic political battles, on the culture war of the week. Meanwhile, some of the most consequential negotiations about the future of American economic power are happening in palaces and sovereign wealth offices in the Gulf, conducted by people who are extraordinarily sophisticated, who have very long time horizons, and who are making trillion-dollar decisions based on their assessment of whether America is still a reliable partner and a safe home for their capital. That asymmetry of attention is itself a kind of vulnerability. When one side of a negotiation is paying close attention and the other side is largely distracted, the outcomes tend to reflect that imbalance. None of this means the Gulf states are about to pull the plug tomorrow. These are not impulsive actors. They move carefully, they hedge, they communicate through back channels, and they prefer gradual repositioning to dramatic exits. But gradual repositioning at the scale of trillions of dollars is not a minor event. It is a structural shift in the global financial order, and it has compounding effects that build over time even when no single moment looks catastrophic. The frog does not notice the water heating until it is very close to boiling. The American public deserves to understand that the water is being heated right now, not by a foreign enemy acting out of hostility, but by former partners acting out of rational self-interest in response to signals coming from Washington itself. And the most important signal any government can send to its financial partners is the signal of reliability, of consistency, of being a country whose commitments mean something across administrations and across election cycles. That is the signal that is currently in question. And the trillions of dollars sitting in American markets from these three Gulf nations are, in a very real sense, a referendum on how that question gets answered.